Now, if you watched our last video on heads on post-flop PKO strategy, you'll notice that Dara identified quite a significant leak I had in my game.
I'm looking at it in GTO Wizard now. Now they don't have 200 big blinds; they have 100 big blinds. But at 200 big blinds, sorry, 100 big blinds, GTO Wizard in this exact spot checks 93.5% of its range.
Fuck off, really? Oh wow! So I've got this. Okay, we've got some stuff to learn today. So I thought I'd delve into that a little bit more today, and this is probably a good opportunity for us to officially introduce our new book, which, if it's not out by the time this video goes out, it's almost certainly going to be out within a week of this video going out. And the book is called Beyond GTO Poker Exploits Simplified. We've gone for another imaginative name there, Tara.
Yeah, at least we don't have poker strategy in the title.
Oh no, there's still time. We could get that in, don't we?
po po poker exploit simplified strategy or poker exploit strategy simplified. Yeah, it's literally taking the piss now.
What we
I guess it'd be piss, not piss, but still.
what we've done in the book is we've identified lots and lots of very common exploits, leaks that people have in the games, and then we've looked at the solver-approved method for exploiting that. What I'm going to do today in this video is pick out a exploit we didn't include in the book, but we quickly identified as a leak that I had in my game, and that was I bet too much out of position.
Mhm.
The context is I would I would be an early position raiser. I would get called. Um, by say the cutoff or the button, and the flop would come down something like ace, high card, low card, something that I felt I had significant range advantage on. So I would lead out quite a lot. And then, as Dara explained to me, like the positional disadvantage of that still leans you strongly towards checking in a lot of those situations. So before
Yeah,
we look at exploits,
it's
as
one of
Dara
it's one of those things which again comes up a lot in the book that the problem is not when you have a hand. The problem is when you don't have a hand. If
right.
you're betting all of your strong hands out of position, then when you check, your checking range becomes a check fold range, and you become really easy to exploit. Players can start calling you wide pre-flop, knowing that you're going to just check if you miss, or if you go the other way and you're betting too much when you miss, then the positional disadvantage starts to weigh against you because particularly on boards where you don't have enough strong hands. This was very well explained on the most recent chip race at the time of recording by Jason Kuhn. Kuhn played a
Mm.
hand against Pardo where he had ace queen and the board came queen 6-6, and he explains perfectly all the reasons why he just check called the whole way rather than betting. It's a very common leak. Even old school players just routinely throw out C bets in these spots. When we put this up on Twitter, Joe Beavers came on to say that he would definitely see bet as well. I think
Mhm.
most of the old school players would. To give them some credit, it's actually an effective strategy against fish.
Yeah.
Fish will overfold. They won't exploit you. They won't notice that you're betting. That when you check, you just don't have enough hands to check call and exploit you that way. So a very common exploit that the crushers have identified when they're playing out of position against fish is they just bet they see bet 100% at a very small size because the fish will fold 100%.
And I think that's why I have been getting away with this particular leak, because in the games that I play, it works. They tend to just call behind and let me bet another street without giving me much worry. I was very curious about this. I went into GTO Wizard, if you can see that, and I looked at some spots, like what are the most common spots where we would check out a position, what are the most common spots where we would bet out of position, and what were the frequencies. This is 80 big blinds, under the gun raisers, and the cut-off calls. And if you look at the top, like 57% of the time you're supposed to be checking. This is the aggregate here.
Yeah.
Um, and quite interesting. The times when we bet all the time are when it's trips or pairs on the board, which kind of makes sense to me because it's on a flop like Jack, 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 it really is down to who has the stronger hand pre-flop. most of
Exactly. Yeah. It's essentially it's like three baseball cards just flopped. There's there's little or no chance anybody has the missing jack. So whoever had
Mm,
the best hand pre-flop still has the best hand. There's another general heuristic in these spots too, which is that the further apart the players are,
mm,
the more betting the opener does. But for example, so for example, UTG versus button, there'll be a decent amount of betting and not as
yeah,
much betting. But UTG against UTG1, there'll be
yeah.
very little betting. Because
Which it
UTG
makes perfect sense because the bigger the distance, the stronger the range advantage, right? So the more you can actually make
exactly,
that count.
exactly.
And then just for those that are interested, looking at the spots where you're supposed to check most of the time, also quite interesting. So it's like ace three two two hearts, four three two two hearts, and I looked at this down at shallower stack depths, and this would happen when it would be three hearts on the board and one of them was an ace. And it kind of makes sense because that means, if it's an ace and two of the ace of hearts and two of the hearts, the chances of the under the gun player having a flush is almost non-existent because all their flushes are made with the ace usually. So it yeah. I've kind of come around to that, and so I've picked out a hand that was very similar to the one that we looked at in the previous video, and this normally what I would have done would have been to bet a lot with my top pair hands, top pair good kickers. Obviously, hands like bottom set, a set of jacks I bet with as well. I'd also normally be betting a lot with king queen suited, king 10 suited, queen 10 suited, hands like that. And maybe turning my small pairs into bluffs as well, checking the middle portion of my range. I thought that was a pretty good strategy. As you can see from the GTO solution, actually a bit of a mix for the most part. Hands like pocket sixes bets almost all the time, which makes sense. They unblock the calls. Pocket aces checks a lot to protect the checking range, and also because it's harder for the opponent to have something. There is some betting with hands that I would bet with, like ace queen suited, ace king, and so on. But yeah, Dara, what sticks out to you in this board? And obviously, the important thing here is we check half the time, 53% of the time.
Yeah, there's a couple of things stick out. First of all, another thing we're commenting on is the sizing. Uh,
Mm,
we pretty much we mostly use 20%. And I think a lot of players just wouldn't do this. They'll look at this board and think, well, there's lots of draws, there's lots of gut shots, there's flush draws, etc., etc. And if they're going to bet, they'll bet big. But out of position, you almost always bet small.
yeah.
Um, that's just a general heuristic that sizings go down when you do decide to bet. In terms of what you're betting, obviously you have a lot of strong value hands that would like to start getting value straight away, that don't want it to go check check. So, when you have pocket sixes, when you have ace six suited, those types of hands, and your stronger aces as well. Don't remember, like ace king and ace queen are close to the nuts on this board because they're just very high equity. They're going to be ahead so much. So that's kind of where the value portion of the range is coming. Then a lot of other hands, we just kind of mix everything. We bet at some frequency. Some hands make less natural bets. Like the hand that bets the least is ace two suited,
Yeah.
because that's a pretty good bluff catcher. If it bets, the hands that are going to fold are mostly hands that are behind.
Hmm.
But if it checks, we might get a bluff. We might get a jack to bet for protection, etc., etc. In terms of the bluffs, again, like we are mixing everything, but not surprisingly, the hand we use the most frequently is literally the weakest hand in our range.
Mm,
That has something, which is 7-6 suited. 7-6 suited kind of benefits from getting him to fold anything. Like if he folds 8-9, that's great.
yeah.
If he folds, king 9, that's also great. But it can make a very strong hand if called as well. So that's being used quite a lot. And then everything else is just kind of mixing. That's more to do with board coverage. If we always bet the same types of hands as bluffs, then when we bet and get called, we're not gonna have board coverage on a lot of turns. So the reason why the solver is mixing everything is literally we could have bet anything. We're betting some king X, we're betting some queen X, we're betting some 10x, we're betting some 9x, we're betting our under pairs. So if a 3 rolls off on the turn, we can have improved to a set. We're also betting our ace 3 suited sometimes. So it's mostly a board coverage thing. You can see with the offsuit aces, what it's doing is it's betting ace king off, ace queen off, and then it starts to bet less. Ace 10 off is ace jack off is 2 pair, but ace 10 off is bet at a lower frequency. But then the worst ace 9 off, that's being bet the most, and you often see that it's top and bottom being bet more than middle. With the suited aces, it's complicated by the fact that obviously a6 suited is 2 pair, but you can see that the weaker the suited ace gets, the less it bets, because it doesn't want to get raised.
Yeah. So we'll quickly look at what happens in the two most common scenarios. So the most common scenario is that we check, and then the button has they check behind most of the time, but have a somewhat polarized betting strategy here. They bet quite large on the when they do bet with the obvious value hands and similar bluffs to what we've seen previously. Things like 9-7 suited are going to have a two spades in them at least, or backdoors at least. Why does the button adopt a polarized strategy here when the position player is betting small when they do bet?
Because he basically has a polar range. He has some very strong hands which can bet big for value, and they benefit from betting big. And then the bigger he bets, obviously, the more bluffs he can then work in. But he has a lot of hands that just want to check as well. So it's a classic big bet or check scenario where your strong value wants to bet big. You'll mix that in with some bluffs, but the rest of your range is perfectly happy checking. If you just quickly go into the ranges tab, that's something I always look at when you can see how the two ranges interact. It's actually quite interesting. The under the gun, the low jack raiser actually retains equity advantage, even but he's out of position. So just contrast the way the equities run. Low jack has 52.9% equity, but only 45% of the EV. That's because that's the positional disadvantage right there. He doesn't get to do as much betting. When he does bet, he's going to have to use a smaller size. The in-position player can use his position. He knows which hands in his range are strong enough to go for value with, and he can go big with those, and that allows him to do a lot of bluffs. But if he has a hand in the middle, he can also check. You can see actually when you look at the graph, like over the vast majority of the low jack has a small but decent enough range advantage. But when we get to the top, things change, things switch around, and the ranges basically come together. And that's why the button strategy, he's going to want to bet that top aggressively for a big size, but he's not going to want to bet the whole middle portion of the graph where he has a disadvantage. And then he's going to want to go bluffs. So if you go back to strategy, you can see he's betting his strongest aces, his 2 pairs, his sets. He's checking a little bit with jacks just to protect the check back range. But for the most part, and he's checking a6 suited at a reasonable frequency as well. But for the most part, when he has a very strong hand, he's betting, and he wants to use a big size. Then he actually bets hands like he bets the small pairs at a reasonable frequency too, because they're similar to 7-6 suited in the low jack's seat. They benefit very strongly from folds, because even if the guy's folding nothing, well, that nothing had significant equity against your 2 overcards. So those hands are being used quite a lot. And then we're seeing king queen off used quite a bit, obviously. That's a gut shot. And then we see stuff, and then we just see all sorts of stuff between the jack and the 6 that can basically turn equity. The 9-8 suited, the 9-7 suited, the 8-6 suited, that stuff as well. So that all makes sense to throw in his bluffs. And then we have the huge portion of our range that just wants to check, like hand like King Jack, that mostly just wants to check. Hands like tens, nines, eights, sevens, they don't really have any incentive to bet either. And then the weaker aces have no real incentive to bet either. In fact, most of the aces, it's really only the strongest aces that are betting.
So let's quickly look at what happens. We go back a step and let's what happens when the low jack bets the most common bet size, which is 20% in this instance, and similar kind of story that the hands that raise are also roughly the hands that would have made that big bet when checked to. The hands that call are the hands that don't particularly benefit from raising, so they're the hands that kind of would have checked behind a little bit. And then the hands that fold, not that many of them, to be honest. All the ones that just basically have got no equity whatsoever. Would you agree with that analysis, Dara?
Yeah, I would. Yeah, the most interesting hands for me are the hands that are pocket pairs below the six. They
Right.
literally mix all three, all three options.
Mm-hmm.
So in other words, they're break even bluffs, they're break even calls, and we therefore lose nothing when we fold them either. The solver is choosing the right frequencies. Solver's essentially playing Sudoku, where it has to get the right amount of raises, the right amount of calls, and then it folds everything else. So that's why it's it's using those frequencies. But the interesting thing to think about is what would we do against somebody who was unbalanced if they were betting too much?
Mm.
Um,
Well,
well,
we're about to get into that, Dara, so don't jump the gun.
yeah,
So as a nice segue, GTO Wizard now has a node locking feature, which is essentially what our new book is about. And rather amazing timing. We literally, I think, finished the last node lock in the book the day that GTO Wizard launched their node locking
I was
feature,
the same, yeah.
which probably, and I'm not joking, probably would have saved us 3 months at least. But
Yeah,
yeah,
it reminds me of when we finished GTO Poker Simplified, just as GTO Wizard was catching on,
yeah,
and we had done all of our own sims, the old-fashioned cumbrous way of using Pio, and then they came out and people compared them with the GTO Wizard sims, and they were slightly
yeah.
different. Solvers always produce different output, and everybody was saying your sims are clearly wrong. They don't match GTO
Well,
Wizard.
we do actually have form for releasing books at silly times. We released Poker Satellite Strategy, I think, the day that Matt Savage introduced the milestone
Yeah,
satellite format that's taken over. I personally released the Mental Game of Poker on Black Friday 2011, which I think trumps any bad timing thing. But at least we could say we were on the vanguard of this stuff before it became popular. But for those that don't know, node locking is basically when you go into a solver that has a GTO approved sim and you adjust it to reflect how a real life opponent would play. The solver would then adapt and try to come up with the best strategy with this new information. That's a simplified way of describing it. What I did in this instance was I increased my betting range. So I didn't actually pick out the hands that I think I would have picked here to bet, although it's probably quite close. I actually just decreased the check-in frequency. And I allowed GTO Wizard to decide which of the hands were going to be big bets, small bets, which hands were going to be checks, and so on. So I just wanted to get a more holistic view of what happens when you bet too much in a situation where you should be checking. So the first thing, let's make that 20% bet again with the increased betting range, and luckily for us, GTO Wizard have got something else that would have shaved a month off the book writing process, where you can actually compare two outputs. So on the right, we have the GTO response to a 20% pot bet by the button, and on the left we have the node locked response to our 20% pot bet when we do it too much. Um, and yeah, what sticks out to you, Dara?
well, I focused on the small pairs, and I said that they mix all three options GTO solution, which they do. But you can see that in the node lock solution now, 5s and 4s just never fold. The guy's betting too much. We're going to exploit him by calling more, essentially floating, see what he does on the turn, see if he still likes his hand after we call. But we're also mixing in more raises because he just has more rubbish that he's going to have to fold to the raise. And you know, it might be rubbish, but still 5s and 4s doesn't mind when it folds because that rubbish has equity against us. You can also see that we're playing the top of our range more aggressively. Ace Jack suited is doing absolutely no checking now. Ace Queen suited and Ace 10 suited are betting more frequently. Ace King off is betting more frequently. Basically, all that value stuff up there is betting more frequently, and Ace 6 suited is betting more frequently. So we increase our value range, and that allows us to also, you know, raise 5s, 4s, 3s more often as well. And just generally across our range, you see that we just do more raising, period.
Yeah. We for example, here you can see we raise 30% of the time now, facing someone who bets too much compared to
yeah, we call almost the same. We call almost the same amount because most of our hands that want to call still kind of want to call, but we're basically raising more and folding less.
And I think we can put some numbers on what this costs us as well. So the equity. Oh, actually, no, the equity does change because it's a different range against a different range. But
the EV though, the EV is
a significant thing. So we lose about 0.4.
Yeah, 0.39, which is very significant. Like that's 0.39. That's 39 big blinds per 100. If you're making these kind of mistakes routinely, that's going to add up to something in the region of 40 big blinds per 100, which is fungus. A cash game player, it would just be disastrous. But even for a tournament player, it's pretty bad. And it kind of shows you that if you are playing against players who know how to adjust to somebody who's betting too much, you are potentially losing a ton of EV.
Yeah. So that's that would probably make a lot of intuitive sense to people. You bet too much out of position. The response is to raise more against it. What I think's more interesting is if we go back a step. So a reminder that we in the GTO solution, we're supposed to check more than half the time. In this solution, we're checking just 20%, 19% of the time. And I wanted to look at what happens when we check, when we've been sort of known to be a habitual bettor in these spots. So let's do the comparison again. And again, on the right, when we check, this is what happens in the GTO world, and on the left, this is what happens in the node lock world. The betting frequency has gone up tremendously. Is the only way to look at it. So the button would check behind 67% of the time in GTO world. But they're only checking behind 10% of the time now, which means they're betting 90% of the time compared to 33% of the time. So
yeah, this is the problem of taking all the strong hands out of your range and betting them. Now your checking range is literally turning into something resembling a check fold range, and your opponent can just pounce now. The other interesting thing, of course, is that the sizing has changed. In GTO world, as we identified, like we use this polar strategy where we mostly bet big or we check. But now because we're not checking, but we clearly can't just bet big with our entire range because then we have far too much bluffs. We start working in all the small sizes. So essentially what happens is most of the checks we just bet at a small size to get him to fold his now very, very capped checking range.
Yeah, and it's important to note that the check-in range is the check-in range that GTO Wizard picked out when I forced it to check infrequently. So it's there's still some sort of balance in there. I could have picked out a typical fish checking range in this
Yeah.
scenario. Probably
Yeah.
would have been my checking range, to be honest. And I think you probably get exploited even more significantly. But so this is letting GTO Wizard pick out the best bad range it could do, and it's
Yeah,
still
absolutely, and that's an important point because I mean, fish definitely won't be balanced in this spot. Their range will be even more capped,
yeah.
and I'm pretty sure the exploit then would be just never check when they check, just always bet.
Yeah, yeah. And if we look at the what it costs us, it costs a whole big blind more of equity, which
Yeah,
is I mean that's hemorrhaging money, right?
that's absolutely hemorrhaging. Yeah, yeah. It's now we're not doing that much checking, so it's a less frequent event than when we're
Mm,
betting. But nevertheless, it does mean when we do check, the 20% of our range or whatever it was that we're checking, we're more or less goosed.
yeah.
We have almost no equity. Like when we're balanced, uh, we have 3.25 big blinds in equity to the
Mhm.
button's 3.85. But as you said, we lose more than a big blind to that when we're unbalanced. So it's more striking. It is a lower frequency event because we're betting more than we're checking. That is the mistake we're making. But even when we bet, like we're losing money,
Mm.
we're losing EV, and then when we check, we're just losing basically a third of our EV.
So let's say we're at we've now learned this, Dara. We're at the real life tables. And I guess what are you looking at to identify whether one of your opponents has this leak? And do you just essentially just ramp up the aggression against these players in both scenarios, against the bet and against the check?
Yeah, you see some guys who just auto C bet, like they literally never check. At least heads up, multi-way
Yeah.
it's a bit different, but heads up, you'll see guys that they just have that old-fashioned mentality of, well, I raised before the flop, the other guy's only called, so therefore I'm supposed to C bet. If they do any checking, it'll be on boards that are clearly very bad for them, like 6-5-4,
Mhm.
those types of boards. But on A-side boards, they'll just literally fire at the C bet 100%. And this is most live players, in my experience, at least at the lower levels. So you don't even have to be particularly observant to pick them out. You'll notice the guys who are not doing it more than the guys who are doing it. So the vast majority of live players can be exploited in this way.
Yeah. And then if you to flip it around, if you were going to take the betting a lot out of position line in situations like this, I'm guessing that you'd be betting into players that you reliably think would either call a lot, fold a lot, or I guess in a very specific situation, raise a lot without without the goods. You're looking for. I guess you could be up against all three types of opponent for it to be a good strategy, but the important thing is that they're unbalanced in some way. Have I got that right?
Yeah, if they're unbalanced in any way, you can exploit them, obviously. The guys who are going to raise too much, you want to bluff catch more with the middle of your range, but you want to raise, you want to bet the top of your range to give them the opportunity to raise and get a lot of money in that way. Um, the guys who call too much, you can definitely get away with just betting more. Like we saw this in the GTO, Beyond GTO book. If so long as you're not getting raised, you get to do a lot of opening pre-flop and betting post-flop.
Yeah.
Um, the reason why we don't bet a lot of hands is we don't want to get raised off equity.
Mm.
And I'd say the reason we can't get away with opening at a tough table a lot of hands is we'll just have too many hands that can't withstand a three bet. But when players are not doing that, then you can get away with it because you get to see the next card. So you can, and that's why the popular exploit that crushers talk about when they're playing against, in their words, live fish is just auto c bet small.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because they'll fold when they've missed. They won't raise you when they have something which they should have put more money in with. And then you get to see the turn, and you get to make decisions based on what turn card comes and what sense you've got about them. And then the guys who fold too much, obviously, it's self-explanatory that you just bet. But again, use a smaller size, because if they have some, usually the calling ranges are inelastic. But by which I mean, if they have a hand, they're going to call 20% and they're going to call 60% and they're going to call 83%. So when you're bluffing, you just want to bet the small amount. So yeah, again, just bet small. So the sort of bet small, bet everything small exploit, which ironically we identified as a mistake against stronger players, is actually a good exploit against weaker players.
Absolutely. So if you appreciated this video, this is pretty much what we do in Beyond GTO. I don't know how many exploits we go through, but it's something like 30 or 40. It's in a lot of detail, and I think what we're going to do on this channel for the foreseeable future is do a few exploits that didn't make it into the book, so you'll get the benefit from both the videos and the book. If the book isn't out yet, I'm going to put a link at the bottom of the video notes for a link to our mailing list, and that is the first place you will find out when it's available. So once again, Dara, thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Barry. Very, very informative example.